I do believe this is the greatest medical scandal in the history of modern medicine. That wild, insane time when people thought children could be born in the wrong body, men could be lesbians, and it was ethical medical care to chop body parts off teenagers.
They were looking for somebody to take part. And I saw this article by a psychotherapist who'd had gender issues as a kid, who was taking a critical approach. I didn't know they were going to go looking for me. And they asked me to take part in the film. Everybody said, except one person, everybody said, don't touch it. And my husband's like, go for it. Which is Henry to this day. Go for it. Jesus Christ, go for it.
I tend to be and tended to be really conflict averse, just kind of internalize things and think about them, but not speak out. And the world's gotten so crazy that I've gotten to this point where it's like, no, not going to happen. I just have to. To not speak now has a bigger price than speaking out.
Well, hello, everybody. You're very welcome to the first episode of Beyond Gender. We're all very excited and very nervous. My name is Stella O'Malley, and I'm a psychotherapist based in Ireland. And I'm really into this new development. I've been doing, gender wider lens with Sasha Ayad for 4 years. And now we've moved into a new kind of realm. And myself and the lovely Maya and the lovely Bret have joined me in a new podcast, which is kind of exploring gender in society. It's kind of moving beyond gender in many ways and into the kind of what's actually going on in the world today. So to give a little bit of background about myself for anybody who doesn't know, I'm a psychotherapist. I had quite extreme gender issues as a kid for many years, grew out of them, and became comfortable in my own body. And I've really kind of thought back on this. It was decades ago, but I thought back on how did I move beyond those strange years. And it was difficult. It was actually harrowing at the time. But I'm very glad that I didn't medicalize and I wasn't given any option to medicalize. And it was many years later, when I was in my 40s, that I revisited this issue. I never really believed that there was any sort of trans identity. Whenever I met somebody who was medically transitioned, I always presumed, well, they would have been like me. They would have got stuck. They would have mentally got into a place where they thought they should be the opposite sex, and they really were the opposite sex. And I've only ever had really sympathy for anybody who got stuck in that place, but I never saw it as an identity. I always saw it as something that was required a deeper understanding of the self and the body. So Maya, would you maybe introduce yourself and tell us about you?
Sure. Hi, I'm Maya Hughes. I am a journalist and researcher based in Ottawa. I'm originally from England, probably tell from the accent. I've been researching and writing about gender for about 5 years now. And the medical side fascinates me. I do believe this is the greatest medical scandal in the history of modern medicine. But more than that, the cultural side has always fascinated me. What historical, cultural threads have been woven together that have created this particular mad moment in history. And I do believe we're living through something like the Salem witch trials, something like the Satanic Panic, one of those crazy moments in history that for centuries to come, people are going to be talking about it. That wild, insane time when people thought children could be born in the wrong body, men could be lesbians, and it was ethical medical care to chop body parts off teenagers. When you really think about what we're living through, you know that you're living through a particularly extraordinary moment in history that really will be in the history books and will be discussed for a long time to come. And so this podcast, I listened to The Wider Lens for years. I loved The Wider Lens. I learned so much from it. And so I'm honored to be part of the next stage.
Yay, we're honored to have you. And Bret.
So, my name is Bret Alderman. I'm a psychologist, writer, and life coach. And I am so happy to be here with both of you. And particularly, one of the things that Mia was talking about, that sort of social contagion element, is something that I've thought about and addressed in my own writings, but in kind of a little bit of a different way. I think of what Jung might call archetypal possession, the idea of just getting possessed by a particular narrative or a particular kind of type of mythology, and just having all of your thoughts sort of imbued or invested with that sort of narrative. And that's one of the things that I've been writing about recently, particularly in my recent book called Eternal Youth and the Myth of Deconstruction. Shameless plug. But before that book, I was already writing about postmodernism and the focus. It has a particular focus on language. And I really see a lot of what's happening in the gender sphere as having to do with manipulating language, viewing it in a different way, thinking of it in a way that is a lot of ways fundamentally new and different than how we've thought of language in the past. So I kind of feel like I came to the whole topic of gender like through some weird side door, and then because I was writing about a lot of people who were influential in thinking about gender, but I was writing about them before I knew that they were influential in the gender realm. So that's
when did you first discover? I hear you. When did you first discover gender? That because you were writing about bottom, you were writing about it. I mean, you weren't writing about gender.
I think it was 2016. I think it was 2016, maybe 2015. And I remember, when Caitlyn Jenner was on Vanity Fair, and people started talking about how everybody was supposed to say she and not refer to Caitlyn as Bruce. And I thought, well, that's a really interesting imposition on how we're supposed to use language. And I really started connecting the dots there. And then later, about a year later, when I saw Jordan Peterson talking on compelled speech, then things just like, oh, okay, now I get it. There's the through line. Silly me, I was writing about Michel Foucault and didn't know that he's like, foundational to a lot of the thinking around gender, at least for things like queer theory. But I might be getting way ahead of myself here, but that's a little bit about me. Yeah.
Jordan Peterson was a key part of my event too. I remember my peaking kind of came. I knew I had kind of a voice to add to the debate because I was reading about trans issues, and I'd always kept an eye on trans issues because I'd had such an extreme experience as a kid. So I don't kind of read about them that little bit more than other people. And I was noticing that there was a lot of kind of media coverage on trans issues that had never been there before in my life. And every so often I'd make noises to my husband or my sister or whatever, saying, I must write about what happened to me. Because I'd already written a few books on psychology and on mental health. And I was regularly writing for the newspapers at the time, pre-cancellation. And so they'd take any article really that I wanted to write about. So I knew I had a free rein. If I wanted to write about an issue, I could. And I was in a cafe in Birr in County Offaly where I was living. And I was reading about Cyril Doty, this Canadian person who was non-binary and who was who took the Canadian government to court for the right to call the child that this non-binary person had given birth to, you, not M, not male, not F, not female, but you, unassigned or unknown was what it was called. And I was like, but that's imposing beliefs on a baby, because the baby was perfectly healthy. There was no intersex, there was no issue with this baby. It was a non-binary mother who wanted, I presume, who wanted to put basically a you on this child, a non-binary existence on this baby. And the baby was about 9 or 10 months old. And my head nearly fell off and rolled on the ground. I was so outraged at this idea. And I put the newspaper down and said, I'm going to write an article about it. And went back and wrote the article, sent it to the Sunday Independent, which is the main Sunday paper in Ireland, and they published it. Now, it was hot enough, this was 2017, it was hot enough that they, for the first time ever in all the articles they'd ever written, it was the first time they ever had lawyers check over it, and they said they had lawyers check over it, and I was really attentive to detail in everything I wrote, and I have that actual article. We'll put it in the notes of today, but it's quite full on, the article. There's no doubt about it. But funnily enough, I do a little excerpt about Castor Semenya, and I talk about just how male Castor looks. Now, I didn't really know anything. Don't forget, like at this stage, I knew nothing about. I'd never heard of gender identity theory. I'd never heard of John Money. I'd never heard of any of these people. I'd no concept of Judith Butler. I missed all of that. None of it was in my consciousness. And I just say, well, Castor just looks so male. And I now know this is called a psych test that is perfectly valid for a woman to have, like, an instinctive response to a male presence. But I talk about different, aspects of my own experience as a child. And I just say, where's my voice in this debate? And from that, a kind of a domino effect, I was asked to, first of all, take part in a film. I didn't know that this crowd, they were an independent production company. They were looking for somebody to take part. And I was a psychotherapist, and they were just scouring the media. And they saw this article by a psychotherapist who'd had gender issues as a kid, who was taking a critical approach. I didn't know they were going to go looking for me. And they asked me to take part in the film. And then they asked would I could be a presenter in the film. And at the time, I was like, oh, this is kind of a departure of my quiet life in rural Ireland. And I remember everybody said, don't go near it. I remember my sister said, don't move. That would be just trouble. And my friend saying, Jesus, no, Christ. So this is 2017. And at that point, transactivism had clearly cut through into rural Ireland, that everybody said, except one person, everybody said, don't touch it. It's just trouble. Don't near it. And my husband's like, go for it. Which is Henry to this day. Go for it. Jesus Christ, go for it. What off opportunity. Little do I know, yeah. And from then on, everything kind of spiraled. But there was two other moments, and then I'll put the floor over to you two. Two other moments kind of went into my mind. So it was Cyril Doty, the little baby. Then, let me think about this. I read Janice Turner's article about Tara Wolff, and I was in a radio station, and Janice Turner had an article, something like, when is it okay for a 27-year-old male to punch a 60-year-old woman in the face? And I was like, what is this? What is going on? And I remember I turned to the producer. I was in the radio talking about something completely different, and I said, you have to read this article. I'd never met the woman in my life, but I was like, this is the most insane article I've ever read in my life. It's so mad. By the way, just in case you don't know Bret or any of your listeners, Tara Wolff was a trans woman, male, 27-year-old, male-bodied, and punched Maria McLaughlin in the face. Oh. And there was a terrible court case where Maria was being asked to call this Gurwinder, this thug, who had punched her in the face, a she, her. He wasn't she, her. So that was an extraordinary moment. And the last moment, which finally just kind of made me realize something weird is happening, was Jordan Peterson. And somebody in the same cafe that I'd read the first article, somebody said, you remind me of Jordan Peterson. I said, who's Jordan Peterson? And he goes, oh, well, Jordan Peterson. You have to check out Jordan Peterson. And he sent me a link. And I was like, this guy's brilliant. This guy's amazing. And I couldn't get over all the controversy. And so many people contacted me. I was on Facebook. I hadn't touched Twitter by then. And so many people contacted me saying, he's dangerous, Stella. Stay away from him. And me going, he's a psychologist. What are you talking about? He's talking about psychology. So they were big moments in my life. So you tell me, Mia, where were you and all that? So that was all 2018, 2017, 2018.
Right. My story is mine's an interesting one too. In 2017, 2018, it's embarrassing to admit that I was a bit woke. I was still woke. Not like horrendously so.
Woke?
No, I actually didn't. That's a good question. So because I'm a Brit, I was living in Taiwan. I met a Canadian, married him in Taiwan, had my first child in Taiwan, and then we moved to Canada. So that was 2010. And I had no friends at all, starting afresh as an immigrant. And all of the friends that because I leaned to the left politically, all of the friends that I made were on the left politically. I just gravitated towards them because I thought, people on the right were bad people at that time. And so I didn't really, they all had strange beliefs, not so much actually in 2010, I had no friends. I didn't make any friends until I moved to Ontario in 2012. And they had strange beliefs. Starting around 2015, 2016, I noticed that my friend group they were saying things like trans women are women, which I thought was odd. I didn't think they really believed trans women were women. I just thought we were all going along and saying it to be kind. And, all white people are racist and all the rest of it. And all of these bizarre beliefs, to the point that I don't remember when it was, but somewhere along the way, one of my friends added me to a Facebook group. And I'm not joking. This Facebook group was called Unpacking Your White Privilege. And so I joined this Facebook group and I scrolled for about 5-10 minutes and I realized this is definitely not for me. And I left immediately. It was just completely ridiculous. And then I had my first, does that make me racist? Is this going to make me a bad person? Are people going to be angry with me because I left this Unpacking Your White Privilege group? So there were kind of signs that I wasn't in sync with this group of really woke friends. But I was a mother. I was busy. I was a stay-at-home mum of 3, and I wasn't very political until December 19th, 2019, when J.K. Rowling tweeted in support of Maya Forstater. Probably most of the listeners will know, but I'll give a quick recap. She was a tax consultant, I think. She had been fired for participating in the gender debate, expressing basic facts about humanity, women are female, and all the rest of it. She had lost her job. She went to an employment tribunal. And the first ruling, and this was what JK was tweeting about, went against her. And it was something like her views were not worthy of respect in a democratic society, like just basic describing reality was not worthy of respect in a democratic society. So JK was obviously infuriated. She tweeted in support of Maya. That was the first time she'd gone public. And I saw this tweet. And I read it, and, it was a very measured tweet. I couldn't see anything wrong with it at all. And then I saw absolute mayhem going on underneath, people calling her a TERF and people just losing their minds. So I went over onto Facebook with the tweet and I said, what's wrong with it?
Wait, did you know what a TERF was?
I was vaguely aware that there was a group of women in society who were called TERFs and they were vile transphobes. I had got that from my friend group. They would mention TERFs always in a very negative way. So I was aware that there was this group in society and they were called TERFs. And at that time, I thought they were just evil, horrible transphobes. And so when I saw them calling JK a TERF for that tweet, it didn't make any sense to me because I couldn't see anything wrong with the tweet. There was nothing evil about it. So when I took it into my real life, into Facebook, and I said, I don't see anything wrong with it, then a whole bunch of people on Facebook in my real life started calling her a TERF, and they were really upset about it. And then I remember it was the first time someone shared in the thread that absolutely hilariously titled Scientific American article. It was "Stop Using Phony Science to Justify Your Transphobia." And it's like chock full of phony science. It's chock full of just absolutely outrageous pseudoscience. So it was on that very day, December 19th, 2019, that everything I realized there was something big going on.
Wow.
None of it made sense. I was reading the threads and there's people like debating whether men can be lesbians. I remember seeing some lesbians in the threads saying, you know, men cannot be lesbians, or it was Twitter at the time, you couldn't say that, but males cannot be lesbians and people with penises can't be lesbians and stuff. And there were lots of people actually saying that, you know, they were very offended by that and they were calling the lesbians bigots. And I just thought, this is completely insane. What is going on here? And then I became obsessed. From that very day onwards to this day, I am still completely obsessed. I'm still reading into it. I'm still figuring things out. And it was shortly after that that I discovered detransitioners and what's happening in gender clinics. And that's when I finally got my head around that, that's when I spoke out in real life. And that's a whole story. I don't know. Do you want me to go there?
We'll go there in a minute, but I just want to ask, you know that junk science article? Did you see that it was junk science? Because I remember me and Henry reading a couple of articles back then, before I knew anything about the research. And I was like, oh, this research is saying something kind of incongruous, and what's going on here? It rattled me. I wasn't au fait with reading science journals, so it did rattle me. I remember that.
I knew something was amiss on the very first read of that article. It confused and befuddled me. And it was in Scientific American. So you're like, this is, to me at the time, that was, I now know that it's not legitimate at all. It's complete pseudoscience, but it seemed like a respectable publication at the time. But I knew that what this person was saying did not actually mean that men were women. There was a lot of talk about intersex. There was a lot of talk about brain scans and stuff, but none of it really like drilled home the point that some men are women and therefore lesbians. It was on day one reading it, things did not make sense to me. And it was that day, the JK tweet day, that I realized when they said trans women are women, they meant trans women are women. I didn't realize that until that day. I genuinely didn't think anyone believed it until that day when I realized everyone was freaking out because J.K. Rowling had said sex was real or something like that.
Amazing. Bret, do you remember your, what would we call it, your peaking experience?
You know, I think there's been a few. It's kind of like a mountain range that peaks and peaks and then peaks some more. I think after the Caitlyn Jenner and the Jordan Peterson epiphanies, sometime after that, I was at a dance. I go to these dance venues here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and somebody used that expression, gender assigned at birth. And then something just like, went off in my brain and like, oh, that particular way of thinking of language, I know about that. That's downstream of what I've been writing about, because I've been writing about people who think that language is just sort of something that you create reality with, or you just sort of impose it upon this sort of world that doesn't have any innate, inherent, or intrinsic qualities to it. And I thought, you don't really assign gender. It's you observe something, and then what you observe, you have some words to put to that observation. That's how that works. But even then, it was kind of just like, okay, yeah, I can see this way of thinking is making inroads. That's kind of weird. But, it was still sort of like some random detail in my life. And at that time, I was working, I was actually working in a high school, and I was combination of teaching, but then also working with kids who have behavioral issues. And there did come a moment when I understood that people might expect me to use preferred pronouns to talk to others. And I just thought, oh God, I hope that doesn't happen because I can't go there. I can't do that. That doesn't seem right. And it was about, I don't know, a year or so later that I actually left that and just completely went into private practice. And that was also right around the time of the pandemic. And I think it was the pandemic that really just kind of put me over the edge, in part because I joined a group on Facebook called Critical Therapy Antidote, which
So wait, before you go into that, can I ask, did you leave that school because the preferred pronouns were coming down the road, or was it just life was?
it wasn't that, but that didn't help. No, but I had never. I originally, when I got my degree, I thought I was going to be naively a college professor because I had a PhD, and I thought, well, I'm talented. And after I published my first book, I thought, well, yeah, I'm a published. I got peer reviewed publications, and I got a PhD. Someone's going to hire me as a professor. And when it just became clear to me that that was not going to happen, I thought, okay, I'm going to go into private practice. And do that, which is what I eventually did. But so no, it wasn't directly the pronoun.
And what I say, I jumped in. The COVID pandemic happened, and life went insane.
Yeah, and then I started connecting with different therapists and psychologists. You, Sasha Ayad, Lisa Marciano, Jaco Van Zyl. And that made a big difference. I think it gave me a little bit of the bravery that I couldn't muster on my own to just like really look at the situation directly and say, yeah, this is as insane as I've intuitively felt it to be.
And just say a little bit about Critical Therapy Antidote, because they're a great organization, and they released a book, and I myself and Sasha have 2 chapters in that book. It's really powerful to see therapists coming together and protecting the integrity of therapy.
Yeah, and it was through Critical Therapy Antidote that we wrote collectively a great book called Cynical Therapies, which is all about the encroachment of politics into the therapeutic realm. And it's a wonderful book that we don't talk. There's a section on gender, but there's a lot on race and just all these different ways in which a particular way of framing the world that's both highly political and not the least bit psychologically savvy, is sort of like imposing itself on the area of therapy. It's like, for me, it's astonishing that I feel like people who have no understanding of what is meant by the psyche, have no psychological sensibility or understanding of it, are like they're encroaching into the therapeutic realm and kind of telling people the best way to do therapy, when it's like they don't have even any, they're the least equipped to be doing that. One other big moment for me was, Sasha Ayad contacted me. She had a client that she was not able to see and just asked me if I would be able to work pro bono. And it was a person who was struggling with gender. And I said, sure. And then from there, it just kind of, once people hear that you're kind of willing to go into that area, people start contacting you. So
yeah, I got overwhelmed by emails once the film came out, just overwhelmed by emails. But I want to go into the 2 main beliefs, and Mia, maybe we'll all try and give a stab at it, but I think it's really important for anybody listening that there's a kind of a very clear point to make, which is there's 2 main beliefs in an understanding of a transgender person who's medically transitioned, or however you want to describe them. And most people are on one side of that belief or the other. They have, something around these beliefs. And a lot of people don't even know they have a belief about it. They just have an intuitive sense. So do you want to give a kind of your analysis of what is the controversy? Why are people so heightened? Why did they go for J.K. Rowling and the juggler and all that sort of stuff?
Right. Well, I think to me, the two camps, the two main beliefs are, on the one side, there's it's a kind of born this way narrative, because trans rights looks exactly like gay rights, and that's deliberate. They deliberately made the whole rights movement look like gay rights because gay rights was so successful. They lifted born this way. So they've gone with this idea that some people are just trans, like they're just born that way. It's a natural, healthy variation of human existence, and therefore the only way to solve the pain and the suffering of being a trans person, having this mismatched gender soul residing in the wrong sex body, is to provide these people with hormones and surgeries. Denying them that right would be a human rights violation akin to conversion therapy in homosexuals. So that's the W path and the gender affirming and the trans activist side of things. And then there's the way I see it. And then there's the way that more and more people, I think, are seeing it. And it is, no one is born trans. Even I would go for, well, there's in an innate sense, there's no such thing as a transgender person. No one is trans. People come to the conclusion that they are transgender. So we've culturally created a category of people who are transgender. And that happens all the time. We culturally create new types of people in response to different societal and cultural influences. So we have there's a whole large number of people in the population now who have come to the conclusion that they are transgender for a variety of reasons. Can be autogynephilia, which I'm sure we're going to be talking a lot about. So these are men who are aroused.
It might come up.
I think it might. Men who are aroused by the fantasy of becoming women. They are now, they are understanding themselves as transgender people, as transgender women, they would call themselves. There are garden variety, there are old-fashioned transvestites who are now understanding themselves as a transgender person. There are homosexual people who are extremely gender non-conforming, who are coming to understand themselves as being members of the opposite sex. And then there's the new group. There's the social contagion group. There's the brand new cohort of adolescents and young adults who exploded into existence in the mid-2010s in response to the messaging of the modern trans rights movement. They are just young people in a stage of identity development with various struggles in life, and it can be as simple as just going through puberty. Puberty is difficult. They dislike their secondary sex characteristics, and because they're looking at that discomfort through the lens of gender that has been handed to them by the modern trans rights movement, they're coming to the conclusion that they have this illness called gender dysphoria and they are transgender. They can have suffered trauma. They can be discovering a homosexual identity. They can be on the autism spectrum. They can have ADHD. Whatever it is that is their life challenges at that point in their identity development, because they're viewing it through the lens of gender, they come to the conclusion that they're trans. Not one of them is. No one is innately transgender, but none of these kids who are finding themselves and discovering themselves, not one of them is transgender, but we treat them as if they are because the dominant narrative is the trans activist one, born this way. It is a violation of their human rights not to affirm them. And I think that's where we end up with an actual catastrophe on our hands. And I think the regret and the detransition rates they're going to mirror the graphs that we saw with the social contagion on a long enough timeline.
Well, what's your understanding of it, Bret?
Well, I love the way Mia, made that nice simple dichotomy, and it'll help me kind of explain that kind of downstream of that dichotomy between like the born this way and, let's say, the sex realists. I mean, if you accept one paradigm or the other, then you're going to do therapy in a different way, right? If you accept the born this way idea, then the thinking is, well, then you just affirm what's already there. You do the same thing as you might do with if a person comes out as gay, which would be to say, okay, that's great, you're gay, and we're just gonna help you find a way of living with that. But it also, in a lot of ways, is fundamentally different, because the affirmative approach also requires that other people affirm. So there's certain assumptions that, okay, that means I'm going to have different pronouns. That's going to mean that I have a realistic and rightful expectation to be addressed in a particular way. That's kind of downstream of that belief system. A lot of times, now with the affirmative approach, there's almost an assumption that there also needs to be some degree of medicalization, which is fundamentally just against like the therapeutic milieu, the therapeutic ethos. It's like, it's really, really rare. If you're really doing therapy, your first go-to move is not like, we're going to medicate you, we're going to do some surgery because you have a psychological issue. The first go-to is like, okay, well, let's explore this issue. What's going on? Someone comes to your office with any other condition, you don't say you're Napoleon Bonaparte. Oh, okay. Yeah. How's that feel to be we're going to, expect now everybody else to call you Napoleon Bonaparte, and Napoleon Bonaparte is your true self. And we're just going to go with that. Right. I mean, it's absurd. The other approach, right? Now we're talking on the other side of that dichotomy, the sex realist or the gender critical way of framing things. Downstream of that is what I would call the exploratory approach, which is essentially just kind of doing what therapists have been doing now for a century or more. It's like, well, you ask open-ended questions. You say that you're born in the wrong body. Well, I mean, what does that mean to you? How's that feel? Since when have you felt like that? And hopefully you elicit stories. Hopefully in asking these sort of open-ended questions, you get your client to hear themselves speaking and recognizing maybe some of the contradictions in what they're saying. Maybe, in hearing them talk about being in the wrong body, you'll notice when they get when a little bit of emotion will start to come up, you'll notice that something's really emotionally charged. You stop and you explore that a bit more, and it's really exploratory. It doesn't come in with the idea that we already know what's supposed to happen. Good therapy doesn't do that. Good therapy is like, we're going to ask questions and see where this goes and see what is happening in the psyche of the individual. One of the things that has frustrated me so much about this whole, not just the affirmative approach, but the whole the way this becomes such a hugely political issue is that, if somebody comes in with the belief that they're born in the wrong body or that they should have been born the opposite sex or whatever, that's important information. It's not just a falsehood. It's not just a false philosophical belief. I mean, it's that, but it's also something more. It's like, well, what does that mean? Is that a metaphor for something else going on in your life? I mean, it's important information for the therapist, and it's important to be able to investigate that, and think of it. Is it metaphorical? Is it symbolic? Is it a reaction to other things going on in a person's life? But if we're really stuck in this sort of, conflict, cultural conflict, in which we either have to affirm, or, argue against the idea, it makes it really hard to do therapy. I hope that makes.
No, it did make sense. And I was thinking about my own journey because I kind of in many ways I missed, the whole social kind of milieu that you described, Mia. I missed that. I was in rural Ireland raising my kids. It just wasn't there. That whole woke thing wasn't in my life at all. Not that I can remember anyway. And, you were following it. You were studying, let's say, deconstructionism and things like that and postmodernism. I was nowhere near that either, Bret. So I wasn't where you two were at. So when people started talking about true trans and like the trans identity, it was like the way Mia was about the trans women are women. I just thought, oh, that's a nice description for people. I didn't for even a second take it like people actually thought there's a trans identity within them. I couldn't conceive that people actually thought that. Just like me would say, well, this is a polite thing to say. Okay, right, and you're right, whatever. You feel it deeply, evidently, was what I thought that meant. And I didn't realize that people actually meant that there's some sort of gendered soul, just like the Christian soul. And this soul is trans. And that I was really slow to understand that this was a very strong belief that had happened in my own lifetime, and I hadn't noticed it happening. I just literally hadn't noticed it happening. But what I think is interesting from studying it in the last 7 years is what I've noticed is identity. And that's what I'm very interested in exploring in our podcast. Identity has become massive. And when I was a kid, I think, I came from, like, I was an Irish Catholic, and it was very, very strong. You were Irish and you were Catholic. And then it was my family, if you follow me. I was an O'Malley. And, you knew where you were in life. You know what I mean? It was very solid, and it was very intractable nearly. And I'm sure lots of people found that very oppressive, you know what I mean? Because you might want to be an Irish Catholic or an O'Malley or whatever, but it was a very undebatable part of you. And I think what's happened and what I've noticed in these recent years is that an awful lot of people don't have a solid identity. They don't have that, and they've really cling on to really strong identities. And at the very same time, I'm sure you can speak to it, Bret, but that whole victim oppressor narrative was really coming into life at the very same time. The whole postmodernism and the whole kind of this idea you're either one side or the other, you're kind of part of the problem or the solution. And I think all of that crept up when I wasn't looking. So I didn't really know what people were talking about with the whole true trans identity. I was just so slow to that particular point. And when I finally realized it, I was like, oh, so they don't understand this as a developmental condition. And then I started thinking, so do they think an anorexic person is truly anorexic? And do they think an OCD person with OCD is truly OCD? And my brain just kind of collapsed. It was so anti-psychological, I didn't even know where to begin. It's like, okay, well, they don't know anything about the depths of where our minds can go. Like Jared Manley Hopkins said, the mind has mountains. Where we can go in our mind, like how deep we can go in. This idea just because they think it deeply. And then I remember this terrible moment where I was referred, because I was getting so inundated by people looking for therapy. I was referring them to Irish therapists that I considered were great. And one of, these were ordinary therapists who didn't have any kind of interest in trans, but I knew they were great therapists. So I referred them on, this person wants some therapy and they're gender distressed. And one of the therapists said, no, this person, they really are. And I was like, they really are what? She said, really are trans. And I was like, how are you working in psychology? What the hell? Like, what the hell? Would you say that about an anorexic? Like, they really are. And it defeated me. To this day, I can't understand how anybody who works in psychology thinks that.
Yeah, it's astonishing. One of the things that you said regarding identity, I think, is probably going to come up in a lot of our conversations, because when you were talking about identity, you mentioned your name and you mentioned your, where you were born, and it used to be that identity was understood as something that was sort of intersubjective. It's like, I don't just, it's about who I'm related to. It's about, who I'm in a partnership with. It's the particular locale that I'm from. And now there's a different sense of identity. It's like, it's something that I can know, but only I can know. And it's deep within me. And it's part of my true self. And I can know completely what that true self is. The whole question of identity has become so like solipsistic, utterly subjective, and there's no intersubjective quality. It's like, which means I can identify as 6'5" when I'm 5'9", and that sort of 5'9" is part of the intersubjective, because everybody can kind of see that I'm, that I am, that part of my identity is like, it's not just something I come up with. It's given to me.
We are part of the collective. I know, Mia, that there's a reason why we all know you. And I think it was mostly from the beginning, it was kind of, you're amazing on Twitter, and you used to do these tweet threads. And I think, would you tell us about your first, what blew you up? Like how we all got to know and love you, Mia.
Right. This is the first thread I ever wrote. It's good. So I got banned. I had an account. The account that I had when the JK thing happened, that was in the pre-Elon days. And I built it up, and then I got suspended right around this time in 2021, actually. And so I started again from zero in February 2021. And later in that year, I must have had about 200, 300 followers or something like that. And I was bragging to my tiny number of followers that I had never failed to peak a woke Canadian on the gender issue. Now, to peak someone basically means they hit the peak of the gender nonsense that they can tolerate, and then they come crashing down to reality. That's, in my mind, that's what peaking means. And so I wrote this tweet about the fact that I had never failed to peak a woke Canadian, which was true and still remains to be true. And the TERFs asked me for how I did it. And so I wrote my first ever thread.
Everybody should take out their pens now.
It's unfortunately the first ever thread no longer exists because it got reported. It got mass reported. Thankfully, Graham Linehan, the Glinner, he took it and published it on his Substack in April 2022, I think. So it does still exist, and you can read it. And when I read it now, it makes me laugh because I would never write it like that now. And so I had my peaking technique, though, and this comes about because when I first of all, I see, like, in early 2020, my eyes fall on one of those graphs of referrals to the Tavistock Clinic, and I thought, oh my God, this is obviously an epidemic. Teenage girls, great big spike. And then I'm looking in, I find detransitioners, I find that they're chopping body parts off these kids, I find all kinds of like madness in the medical scandal. So I just started turfing on Facebook. I took it into real life and I start turfing on Facebook. And my really woke friend group find themselves with a TERF in their midst. And this was just mayhem, absolute chaos. And, I don't know if you've ever been in this situation, but I didn't stop. So I would post something really turfy, and then there would be, 160 comments on the one Facebook post. And it was just me against all my friends. It was that kind of it was so bad. It was so awful, and it was chaos. And I just kept on posting and posting because I was sure I was right even back then. And it got to the point, I think, where I was looking at losing all my friends. Just like every friend I'd made since I'd gotten here, I was looking at losing them all. So I decided I like my friends. I don't want to lose them. And so I set tea dates with each one. This is COVID, bear in mind, we can't go in each other's houses. So I arranged to have tea with them in their garden. I drove to their house. I had my thermos of tea and we sat in their garden and we had it out. We just talked about the issue and I never failed. I just never failed. And the approach that I took, and you can read the thread. So
We'll put it in the notes.
Yeah, put it in the notes. I don't know if I would recommend this now. It's funny that I did this. It was a bold move because I kicked things off with autogynephilia. I started the whole conversation and but I put it to them. What I'm going to say is going to be difficult to hear. It's going to be difficult to get your head around, but I assure you it's true. And I really I'm coming from this. I'm coming at this from, I've read, I've looked into this, and we got to talk about autogynephilia. So we talked about, I explained what autogynephilia was. I explained that most trans-identified men were autogynephilic men and everything. And I wish I hadn't put it in the thread, but I had like a folder on my phone of photographs of autogynephilic men that I gleaned from my time on Twitter. And so, because in England, when I was growing up for a long time, we had Hayley Cropper in Coronation Street, a very popular soap opera. And there was a trans-identified male, Hayley Cropper, played by a woman. Hayley was played by a woman. And so I felt that everyone was conditioned when they think trans woman to picture someone like Hayley Cropper, somebody who is actually a woman. She was a woman. And so I had these pictures.
Woman.
Yeah, like
non-threatening, like your mother. That's what Hayley Cropper was. She was a very powerful influencer in people understanding of trans.
I am absolutely, now at this point, I am absolutely convinced that Hayley Cropper was part of the plan. Now that I understand how the trans activists, like the whole trans rights movement, the long game that they were playing, I truly believe Hayley was a part of the plan.
Oh, she
flying
was.
People. I believe that. That's my opinion. I can't prove that, but I do believe that.
There have been documented around that the Trans Media Watch, they were a group that were very much involved in how trans people were portrayed in the media. And they made it their business to try and get a trans person on a soap. And they decided, and they actually hung around the pub where the producers of Coronation Street, the writers of Coronation Street, drank. And they were there for 3 years. For 3 years, they drank in that pub to get Hayley Cropper. They wanted a trans person, and they got a trans person.
Okay, so I was right.
I'm not
but I didn't know that. Okay, so and it worked, right? So I definitely, my friends are like trans women, and me in my mind, Hayley Cropper, and poor vulnerable Hayley. She just wanted to be accepted by the women at the sewing factory.
And I'd say it was brilliant. It was brilliant marketing. It was an extraordinary marketing campaign. Yeah.
Right. Anyway, so that's why I had and I put it in the thread that I had an AGP folder on my phone, and that was the part that really got me mass reported into oblivion. And then, okay, so I would start with autogynephilia, explain, what's going on there, show them photographs, then move on to the male lesbian, because everyone who supports trans rights, all of my woke friends, they were supporting trans rights because it was the next gay rights. To them, it was just the next gay rights. That's why I supported it. And so the best way I figured to get them to see the harm was to show them the harm to the lesbian community. And it's so clear. And I saw it on day one, male lesbians, what is that? That's just ridiculously homophobic. And so again, I had a male lesbian folder on my phone that I'd taken from lesbian dating apps, these ridiculous men on lesbian dating apps, and I showed them that. And we talked about how lesbians are being kicked off these dating apps for saying that they're only interested in females, and lesbians are called bigots for refusing these men. And then I draw it back to the fact that these are just autogynephilic men, they're heterosexual, they have a paraphilia, and they think they're lesbians. And by then, you've pretty much got them. If you've delivered it well, you've got them. And then you hit them with the medical scandal. You hit them with what's going on in gender clinics.
Not children. Not children and not sports. It's an unusual peaking technique.
Right. Well, that's it. Like, when you think about it, I don't know that I would do it that way now. I don't know if I would open with autogynephilia, but it made sense to me at the time because I was going for trans women are women, because these are people who repeatedly said trans women are women, trans women are women. And it just, I think it's hard to do it online. And so the thing was meeting in face-to-face, in person. They could see that I was the person that they'd always known and loved. They could hear my voice and they could see that I was being genuine. And you do it in the right way. You know, you don't just launch into ranting about AGPs or anything. But once you get to the medical scandal, like kids having body parts chopped off, again, I had pictures of like teenage girls with mastectomy scars and everything, because they would never have, if you're not on Twitter and if you weren't in that particular part of Twitter, you'd never see those horrific mastectomy scars. You'd never see the actual horror of what this medical treatment really means. So I had it all stored on my phone and I showed them. And then I absolutely every single time had them by the time I described the social contagion and the medical scandal. And then we would talk about self-ID, prisons, sports, all the rest of it. And so the thread, you'll see it. It's the first thread.
How many likes did you get?
Oh, a few thousand. I mean, it was in those days. I had almost no followers, and I had, it was a good few thousand likes, which was a lot for a thread back in those days. And then, like, every weird pivot that my life has taken pretty much up to now has been because of a Twitter thread. Because I wrote that was the first one. Then I wrote the social contagion one, which was comparing the global contagion of bulimia to the gender trans epidemic. That one blew up again, and my account just kind of launched to much, much bigger at that point. And then I wrote another thread about like a bunch of women in Ottawa. They went around and they put stickers on lampposts and they got on the news, and the police were calling for like witnesses for this hate crime and stuff. And I wrote a thread about that. And then the Post Millennial offered me a job. And then I was a reporter for the Post Millennial. And then I wrote that thread about apotemnophilia, where I took a thought experiment of, people who want their healthy limbs chopped off, and imagine a world in which you teach children that you can be born with an innate amputee identity, and a bunch of kids start identifying as amputees and having their legs cut off. And that's when Michael Schellenberger showed up in my DMs and offered me a job based on that thread. So every mad turn in my life has come from a Twitter thread.
Well, I never. You're the only person I know for whom Twitter has worked. You asked a couple of interesting questions just before we finish off, Bret. You asked a couple of interesting questions of me and Nia before. What were they? Because we were talking about this show before this.
Yeah, one of them was actually in my mind as I was listening to you, Mia. How has it affected you personally? Because you went from being kind of a non-public figure to like really a public figure doing public speaking and massive followers, and now that's a lot to adjust to, I imagine.
Indeed it is. You really, if I look back at the person that I was just 5 years ago, right before when I read that tweet, basically JK's tweet, I was timid, I was shy, I needed everyone to like me. I could not stand the thought of anyone not liking me. I didn't have any controversial opinions. And then, the medical scandal just seemed so awful. Like when I was doing that on Facebook, when I was, posting things and all of my friends were just launching onto me and fighting, and it was terrible. I was like panicking, and my heart was racing, and it was awful. It was absolutely awful, but I kept doing it just because it seemed like it was very important to speak about this. And then I recall the first time I was asked to go on the radio, And it was like a 10-minute radio slot. It was live, but a tiny radio station. And I remember my heart was absolutely pounding. I was so nervous I could barely speak because I was not a public speaker at all. I also, around the same time, I met Billboard Chris on Parliament Hill. So I physically took my turfing out onto the streets. It was in 2021 as well. And I was, again, terrified of people seeing me or being...
Can I ask, as a shy and timid person, you put a billboard on your chest?
Yeah, I stood on Parliament Hill with a billboard, and there was panic there. There was actual panic, even people seeing me, people being attacked. There were real, and just what were the implications? What was going to come from that? And it took a long time to really settle into taking it out onto the streets. And then from the radio, we went to podcasts. My first Benjamin Boyce podcast way back in 22. I was nervous. It was I couldn't relax. It was stressful all the way through. And podcasts were like that for a long time until suddenly they weren't. And until it was just plug in the microphone and let's go. And I look forward to them and I love them. And then public speaking, which I'm still getting there. Like that's a whole other something. So by the time this is released, I'm doing this big thing with Peter Boghossian in 2 weeks' time. That's going to be a level of public speaking, a new level of public speaking, I think.
Yeah. You know, what I like about this question and what I like about your response to it, Mia, is it helps me and it can help other people frame all of this in a different way, because from a certain perspective, it just seems like just a disaster, and it is a disaster, and it's tragic and it's terrible. And yet I've seen time and time again that when people respond to the tragedy and the disaster in a particular way, it's like they grow. I mean, their personality just gets bigger and it's more integrated and it's more solid. And it's like sometimes the things that seem most disastrous in our lives or even in the life of the collective, depending on how you handle it, can have like this really positive effect.
Wow.
Yeah.
How do you think you've changed since kind of?
Well, it's kind of similar to Mia's. I mean, Jordan Peterson always talks about, the big five, and one of them is agreeability. And, in general, women tend to be more agreeable, meaning, a little bit less likely to rock the boat and things like that. Well, I'm one of those outliers. I'm a gender bender. I tend to be and tended to be really conflict averse, just kind of internalize things and think about them, but not speak out. And the world's gotten so crazy that I've gotten to this point where it's like, no, not going to happen. I just have to. To not speak now has a bigger price than speaking out. So, I'm really, that's been great. Yeah, and that's huge. And I think my politics have changed too. I was, kind of always leaned left. I went to the now somewhat famous Evergreen State College, which was like notoriously a bastion of like far left thinking. And that's where I got my bachelor's degree. And I kind of carried that forward throughout my life. But now the world has changed so much that I can't even, identify as being on the left. I just sort of feel politically homeless, which is also good because that means that I'm thinking things through a lot more than I used to, rather than just sort of adopting, what people in my surround are thinking too. Yeah.
That's quite interesting, because it's just occurred to me. So all three of us come from the left, I think. And because I do too, and all three of us have kind of moved and kind of thought, what the hell has happened to the left? it's progressive, oppressive. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
the ground has moved under our feet too. I love the was it Colin Wright who's
Colin
got
Wright.
that little that got that meme. It's like the left me, and to a degree I feel like that. It's been a little bit of both, but it's felt like an earthquake either way.
What about you, Stella? I don't see that you were ever timid. You were sure never shy and timid.
As my ma said, like I talk to a passing leaf. You can give me anything and I talk away to it. So no, there's no issue with me talking. And I was regularly talking on various platforms, like, radios and TV, and so none of that was different for me, and none of that bothered me. But I had changed, and it's been a pretty harrowing experience for me, this whole thing, because I have seen, I had a sunnier view of humanity.
Yeah.
I didn't realize how many people were cowardly. I didn't realize how many people would just say something just to keep things, just to keep their lives safe, even when people were being hurt. I thought, like, journalists I saw in, because, they left me, just mainstream journalists in Ireland who became scared to associate with me and talk with me. And I knew they agreed with me. And I knew because I'd had conversations with them, and watching them with absolutely no integrity and cancel me, leave me behind. And also I realized they are literally the most privileged in Ireland. These are very rich people. These are not people who need their salary. Yeah, they could say they need their salary. Yeah, kind of, insofar as they have very expensive cars and houses and have kids in expensive schools. But these were really rich people who had no integrity, who were journalists. What the hell were they journalists for? What's the point? What the hell were they doing? And the very same with psychologists realizing that all these people that I thought had a psychological kind of way of thinking, and they didn't understand that a psychological problem was right in front of their faces. I kind of saw all sorts of sides. So many people that I met that I've seen act in very bad ways that I didn't expect. I didn't realize. I thought people were better than that. And I never understood history. I never understood how did Mao's Cultural Revolution happen. I never understood Stasi Germany. I never understood, Stalin. I never understood Nazi Germany. I didn't understand how it happened. Now I do. Now I've kind of seen classes, and I've seen them not only with gender, I've seen them now in lots of other realms, and we're going to speak about this in our podcast. But I've seen it again and again, and I think I'm a darker person now. I'm pretty shook from what I've seen. I'm 8 years in, and I'm pretty shook by what I've seen. So it's not great, is it?
Yeah. That really resonates with me. I've been disillusioned, I guess, with people, and witnessed, collective insanity, like up front when you're living it, is very different than, reading about it as a historical fact. And also just the experience, and I imagine both of you can relate. You might have like idols or like heroes or like artists that you love, and then you see them come out on the various issues, and you're like, oh, no.
I'm still not over Margaret Atwood. That was 2020, I believe, and I'm still not over it. The woman who wrote The Handmaid's Tale thinks men can be women. It was
or doesn't have the integrity to nail her colours to the mast, if you follow me. Or does she think it? I
mean, she really, people tried to talk to her at the time, and she was just waffling on about slug sex and clownfish. It was really a devastating moment for me. I loved that book. I still do love the book. You got to separate the artist from the art, I suppose.
Yeah, we've got so much more to talk about. We've got some brilliant guests lined up and so many subjects that we're going to get really, really deep into. I suppose I'm most excited about seeing it in the wider realm now. I'm like, trans is the canary in the coal mine. Something has happened. And as you just said, Bret, there's a kind of collective kind of delusion. There's a collective madness in the air that wasn't in the air for me 8 years ago. It just wasn't there. I think it was starting to grow, but I just don't think it was in the air the way it's now. It's everywhere. And I think it's really worth really delving into that kind of like on every level. So I'm really looking forward to the episodes to come.
Yeah.
Me too.
Me too. Yeah.